President, it is February 12th, and I am here to remark on an anniversary and tell a story. And it is quite appropriate that Senator Leahy should be here on the floor with me because he is a great friend to Vietnam and has done great work in the U.S.-Vietnam relationship. And we're about to be joined by Senator Carper, who flew in Vietnam as a Navy pilot. This story goes back to February 12th, 1973. February 12th, 1973 was the day that our POWs were freed in Vietnam. I told this story to Dan Sullivan when we were having dinner together a few months ago, and he said, "Sheldon, you should tell that story on the Senate floor and put it in the Senate record." So at Dan's suggestion, I am here today. What happened on February 12th, 1973? Well, two things happened. The first was that the prisoners held in North Vietnam were released at the Hanoi airport and delivered into U.S. custody. And that went quite smoothly. The North was organized, the prisoners were there, the planes were there, and our prisoners released from North Vietnamese custody, this one will look familiar to many of us here. That is our colleague, John McCain. And that day, they climbed aboard their aircraft and went to the Philippines for medical treatment. Down at Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon, things were a little bit different. Huey helicopters had been sent off to the rally point at Loc Ninh, where our helicopters were to pick up 27 American prisoners of war who were held by the Vietcong. And that did not go smoothly. The helicopters took off. The military aircraft, with their hospital insignia, were waiting at Tan Son Nhut for our soldiers and Foreign Service officers to come out. Actually, the longest held Foreign Service officer in the group that was coming out, the longest held POW in the group that was coming out to Tan Son Nhut Airport was a Foreign Service officer who'd been held for more than 7 years. So they were all waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And there were disagreements and uncertainties and suspicions. And so the day when the POWs were supposed to return and come to Tan Son Nhut wore into evening and then into night. While everybody was waiting, there were some dignitaries there. This is the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam at the time, Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker. This is the deputy ambassador. This was the first time a United States embassy had two ambassador rank officials because the operation was so big in Vietnam. The deputy ambassador was a guy named Charles Sheldon Whitehouse, who was my father. And because he was there, and because I was visiting one of a very small group of dependents who were in Vietnam at the time, I was there. So I was on the field at Tan Son Nhut during that long day as we waited for the prisoners to come out, as we tried to get intel on what was holding things up, on why the helicopters were not bringing them back. And the day became night, and they brought out huge Klieg lights that lit up the field. And I can still remember the bright insects flying around in front of the lights against the dark sky and in the hot night on the hot tarmac of the airport. And we waited and we waited and we waited, and we did not know when this was going to happen or what had gone wrong. And then, late into the night, we finally heard the familiar the sound of the helicopters coming, which every person who spent time in Vietnam during that conflict remembers very, very well. And pretty soon they came close enough that you couldn't just hear them, you could see them. You could see the red belly lights flashing on the helicopters. And what happened is something that I will remember always. Obviously, after many years like this, memories can fade a little, but I think I've got this right because it struck me very much at the time. The helicopters came in and they hovered in a row over the airfield. Now, anybody who knows helicopters knows that the easiest thing to do is to fly them forward. It's harder to hover a helicopter than it is to fly it forward. And it's harder to hover a helicopter near the ground because of the variations in the ground effect than it is to hover it up high. And what's very hard, what shows a mastery of helicopter piloting, is to be able to hover low above the ground in traffic with other helicopters around beating the air and making it difficult to stay in place. So here came these helicopters, and they lined up one behind the other at a hover, maybe 4 or 5 feet off the ground. And you could hear the whine of the engines, you could hear the beating of the rotors. The air was all kicked up by the wind that they had put up. But those pilots held that position. And I've never spoken to any of those pilots, but I took it as their last salute to their prisoner of war friends as they brought them out to freedom and ultimately to home. That this was their way they could show their skill and salute these men coming home. And then all at once, must have been a signal on the radio, all of the helicopters, I remember maybe 8 or 10 of them, all settled down at once to the land. And all the skids hit the pavement, and they all, wobbled a little bit and then settled. And the engines kept roaring for a minute, and then on another signal, all the engines shut off. And you could hear them winding down, and you could hear the blades slow down, and you could hear the quiet fall over Tan Son Nhut airfield. And out of those helicopters came these spectral men, these pale, undernourished, often ill men. One had to be carried out on a stretcher. One of them was photographed greeting Ambassador Bunker. How glad he must have been to see a U.S. ambassador. I don't know that there was any time in the history of the United States Foreign Service when anyone was more happy to see a United States ambassador than these men coming off those helicopters were to see our ambassador in Vietnam, to know that they were on their way home. A reporter, one of the legendary Vietnam reporters named Fox Butterfield, wrote about this evening a story from the New York Times, and he closed his story with this. With Ambassador Bunker and with my father was also Fred Wayand, who was the MACV commander, the overall commander of U.S. forces. So here's how he closed out the story. After the freedmen had boarded the plane for the flight to Clark Air Force Base, General Wayand put his arm around General John Vogt, the commander of the 7th Air Force. They stood looking at the departing hospital plane. It's the greatest day we've ever had in Vietnam, General Wayand said. I had the chance to share that day. I had the chance to see what those remarkable helicopter pilots did in that final salute to their colleagues. And I thank Dan Sullivan for urging me to come to the floor and tell that story on this February 12th, the anniversary of their freedom. I yield the floor.